Welcome back to your end of year podcast Jeopardy answer review session. As you've noticed, the Unit 8 Cold War review session was a lot longer than Units 5, 6, and 7. The reason this unit was a lot longer was because you're going to find that the final exam, more than 50% of the final is going to be on Unit 8. So we needed a lot more practice with the Unit 8 content. Let's take a look at number 1, where you needed to read some statements and identify if they are true or false. Letter A, the Cold War consisted of the U.S. and the USSR directly engaged in fighting one another over communism and capitalism. We know that that is false. Although the United States and Soviet Union came very close in Cuba to almost directly fighting each other, they never actually directly engaged in combat. We did see the U.S. send troops to Korea, send troops to Vietnam, but we never saw the USSR's troops physically go to hand combat with the U.S., so F is false. Letter B, the U.S. resented that the USSR joined the Allied powers because of Operation Barbarossa. This is true. If you remember, Operation Barbarossa was the attack where Hitler backstabbed the USSR, and it's going to be this backstabbing that will ultimately lead the USSR to join the Allied powers. Now, the US definitely resented that the USSR only joined the Allied alliance because of this backstab. Resented is when you are very upset about something, you're very angry by something, you kind of have this kind of like hateful feeling towards someone or something. And so the U.S. is going to be very bothered, very resentful that the only reason Stalin joins the Allied powers is because he got backstabbed by Hitler. The U.S. will definitely resent that. Letter C, it was a surprise to the world when the Cold War broke out in 1945. We know that's a lie. It was not a surprise. Way before 1945, the U.S. and USSR, even though they were on the same alliance, during the World War II era, we saw that there was tension building between these two countries, and everybody knew that once World War II ended, everyone knew that the U.S. and USSR would be having some major issues. So it was not a surprise. Let's take a look at D. The Cold War caused the USSR and the U.S. to seek new spheres of influence. This is true. If we remember, a sphere of influence is a fancy way of saying territory. We know that during this Cold War period, the USSR is seeking spheres of influence to spread communism, and the U.S. is seeking spheres of influence to spread capitalism. So D is true. Let's take a look at E. Stalin resented the fact that the United States delayed in creating a two-front war in the Pacific theater. This is false. The reason this is false is because take a look at the theater that is being mentioned in this question, Pacific theater, okay? This would have been true if it said European theater. Stalin resented, was very upset or hateful at the fact that the United States delayed in creating a two-front war in the European theater. If we remember, one of the ways that the Allied powers was going to go ahead and defeat Germany was by creating a two-front war against Germany. The Soviets would come in from the east, attacking the eastern side, and the US and Great Britain would launch an attack to Germany by coming in through France and basically causing a push in from the west. And so coming in from the west, coming in from the east, this would create a two-front war. Now, if we remember, the United States and Great Britain decided, you know what? Before we go ahead and we launch this two-front war attack, before we go ahead and start that, we actually want to focus on Africa first. We want to go into Africa and we want to try to get rid of some of the strongholds that Mussolini and Hitler have in Africa. And so it is true that the United States will contact Stalin and say, Stalin, we will eventually launch this two-front war. We will eventually send troops to France with Operation D-Day so we can come in and push in from the west, but it's not going to happen right away. First, we want to focus on Africa. And that really infuriated Stalin because this meant that Stalin would continue having to fight Germany on his own in Europe while Great Britain and the United States went into Africa. And so that did upset Stalin, but it was upsetting because this delay was happening in the European theater. Let's take a look at number 2. Which statement about capitalism is not true? The lie is D. Nations that practice this are often called Eastern nations. This is something you just have to remember. Anytime you hear the word Western, it refers to a capitalist country during the Cold War, and anytime we hear Eastern, it refers to a communist country. So when we heard about the Western nations, that refer to the United States, Great Britain, France. Western Europe was a side of the continent that was capitalist. Western Germany was capitalist, whereas when we hear Eastern, Eastern Germany was a communist portion of the continent. Eastern Berlin was a portion of Germany that was communist. The USSR is on the eastern side of the European continent, and so East refers to communist, therefore D is false. Let's take a look at number 3. All of the following are reasons why during World War II the US and USSR alliance was a tense one, except the lie is D. Stalin broke his promise of free elections in Western Europe. Now, it's true that Stalin did break some election promises, but these election promises were made in Eastern Europe, and so that's why D is the lie. Again, remember that the Soviet Union is on the eastern side of Germany, and as Stalin is coming down from the east on his way to Germany to attack Hitler, as he's coming in on the east, he's basically freeing all these eastern countries that had previously been under Hitler's control. As he's coming in and freeing these countries, he's promising Great Britain and France and the US, hey, I'm coming and I'm kicking the Germans out of these eastern countries, and I'm going to give these eastern countries free elections, meaning I'm going to allow them to choose through election if they want to be communist, if they want to be capitalist, if they want to be democracies. I'm going to let them choose what their future is. He makes this promise to the Allied powers at the Yalta Conference, but we later find out that he breaks this promise. So D is the lie because it's Eastern Europe where these elections were promised and then taken away. Let's take a look at number 4, where we're going to compare and contrast the Yalta Conference to the Potsdam Conference. This was a much harder question. If you get any of these answers, any of these 9 answers wrong, you automatically get question 4 wrong, okay? So even if you get 7 out of 9 on this diagram, you got 1 wrong, you automatically get question 4 wrong. All right, let's take a look at this. Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference, we know, occurred during the end of World War II, and specifically when World War II was kind of coming to an end in Europe. So the Yalta Conference happens right before the Allied powers know, hey, we're going to be able to defeat Hitler soon. We also know F, the decision for Germany's unconditional surrender and its division was made at this conference. Again, the big 3, Stalin, FDR, Winston Churchill, these big 3 leaders, they already know that they're going to be able to win World War II in Europe, and so they decide, let's go ahead and demand Germany's unconditional surrender, and let's go ahead and start talking about the division of this trophy Germany, specifically the division of Berlin. Finally, H, Stalin advised FDR that he would join the war in the Pacific. Stalin, sensing that war in Europe is almost over, realizes I need to start focusing on how I can make sure I get spheres of influence in the Pacific, and one of those ways is by helping the United States and anyone else interested in defeating Japan by helping them defeat Japan so that I can have a reason to claim territory in that area. How are these conferences similar? Let's take a look at some similarities. C, the main leaders that attended were called the Big 3. Even though FDR dies, the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt dies, and President Harry S. Truman will step in and take his place. Harry S. Truman from the U.S., Stalin from the Soviet Union, Winston Churchill from Great Britain. These 3 nations, these 3 leaders will still be called the Big 3, not only in the Potsdam Conference, but also in the Yalta Conference, even though in Yalta, President FDR was representing the U.S. Let's take a look at the next fact. E, the U.S. and USSR and Great Britain attended. Again, these 3 countries right here represent the Big 3 that were at both of these conferences. And then finally, I. They are World War II conferences in which Stalin felt he was not given much say. Both at Yalta and at Potsdam, Stalin felt very, very frustrated that pretty much the U.S. and Great Britain, 2 capitalist allied power countries, were kind of running most of the decision-making in these conferences. Let's take a look at Potsdam. B. Truman already knew he could avoid Stalin joining World War II in the Pacific due to the success of the Manhattan Project. So Truman steps in and realizes, I don't really need to negotiate or work very much with Stalin. I have a card, a secret card here in my deck of cards, and this secret card, the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, is going to give me a ton of superiority over my communist enemy, which technically, even though he's a communist enemy, he's on my alliance. So kind of some tricky stuff here. Let's take a look at the next option. D, Stalin broke his promise of free elections in Eastern Europe. It's going to be at Yalta, where he promises free elections, but in Potsdam, where he breaks this promise because he starts to sense that he can't trust Truman, that Truman has something kind of up his sleeve, and so this is where he breaks those elections. The final option we should have written down is G, occurred during the end of World War II in the Pacific Theater. So we know that Potsdam, when Potsdam takes place, Germany's already been defeated, but Potsdam is happening kind of around the time where the Allies can already see Japan will soon be defeated, okay? Again, if you got any of these answers incorrect, you automatically got number 4 wrong. Let's take a look at number 5. Which historical statement about this image is not true? With Western Europe now being dominated by communism and Eastern Europe now being dominated by capitalism, the famous term Iron Curtain was created to symbolize the ideological division in Europe. Now, there was something called the Iron Curtain, which was an imaginary line that was used during the Cold War to say, hey, this kind of area right here, this kind of has an iron curtain where nobody kind of crosses because everyone here on Western side is capitalist and everyone here on the Eastern side is communist. And so the idea that there is a line here, imaginary line called the Iron Curtain, this is true. But what is false in this statement is that Western Europe was now a communist country. That is false. Remember, Western is capitalist. Eastern is communist. So if we had changed the top portion, the answer would be correct. We know the West is capitalist, the East is communist, and so the statement is false because it's saying Western communist, that's wrong. Eastern capitalist, that's wrong. We've only gotten up to question 5 and we still have several more to go through, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this part of the Unit 8 podcast. Please go ahead and scroll down to the details. In the details section, you'll be able to find the second part for the Unit 8 podcast. On the second part of the Unit 8 podcast, we'll pick up with question number 6 and get as far as we can.